The rope face pull is often seen as one of the best rear delt exercises out there. But I'm going to disagree with that, and I'm going to tell you exactly why and what you should do to train your rear delts instead. So first of all, just to orient ourselves, this is representative of someone's rib cage, this oval, this is their collarbone, this is their shoulder blade, and this is the upper arm. And the way we're looking at this is from top down, right? So imagine you're doing a rope face pull and there is a drone camera above you looking down. That's how we're looking at this. What is the rope face pull asking of our bodies in terms of how do we have to resist what is happening to us in the motion? Well, in this position, when our arms are straight, where is the rope pulling you? If I can just represent this with the red arrow going through the arm, it's pulling the arms forward, right? So many of you, if you're watching at home, you can do this, just like grab onto something forward and like lean back against it. In other words, mimic what is happening at that point in a face pull. It's not moving your arms in any direction really, it's just sort of pulling your shoulder blades forward and pulling your collarbones forward, right? This bone and this bone, it's pivoting them in a forward direction. And so already we have a little bit of an issue, which is that if we think about the anatomy of the rear delts attach somewhere from the upper arm, and they wrap around this little head of the upper arm onto the shoulder blade. And what that means is that from this position, they're not going to contribute to moving either one of these bones, which is what's loaded in this position. They're basically just going to pull the arm outward in this direction somewhere, right? And many of you know this, right? Experientially, what do we do for rear delts? Generally, stuff that kind of looks like this. Now, that's just the beginning of the motion, right? So I'll give credit where credit is due to the rope face pull, which is that by the time we get back to this position, and by the time that our arm gets maybe somewhere out here, that load of, let's say, the cable or the rope will be pulling us somewhere forward like this. But once we get to this position, if we think about sort of how the anatomy of the rear delt changes, it's kind of pulling almost inward toward the body this way. In other words, by the time we get back here, the rear delt doesn't really have a super powerful ability to pull the arm backward, although it's one of the only things to pull the arm backward in this position, out wide. So it will obviously contribute and it will prevent the arm from moving forward. By the time we get here, if we think about just what's loaded more, is the joint that is closer to this load loaded more, or is the joint that is farther away from this load, i.e. the collarbone, loaded more? And hopefully you can see that this distance is shorter compared to this one. And so in either one of these positions, we basically have a resistance slash joint position slash muscle position that is pretty suboptimal for actually loading this muscle. And so what we would want ideally instead is to use a resistance that right from the get-go of the exercise was loading the muscle that we were trying to train. So again, picturing the rear delt here, it pulls the arm outward. What kind of resistance would we want to use instead of one that is just pulling the arm forward? Well, we would want a resistance that is pulling the arm across the body that way. Why? Well, because if we have a resistance that is pulling the arm this way instead of forward, now immediately in this sort of position where my arm is here or even across my body, not only is the rear delt in a really strong position to pull the arm outward, but that motion of me moving my arm in an outward direction is immediately and substantially loaded. And at the same time, all these other bones, this collarbone and this shoulder blade, are going to relatively not need to move as much. In other words, meaning that the muscles that control these two bones, i.e. the traps, which sit somewhere back here on the backside, they're not really going to need to pick up a ton of slack, especially at this point in the motion. And by the time that you get to this position, where again, this rear delt does not have a great ability to continue to pull the arm backward, that cable load, if you can imagine sort of where it goes, is it moves much closer to the arm. So by the time I get, back here where my arm is sort of in line with my body, the cable is maybe then pulling me across the body to some degree this way. In other words, where the rear delt becomes weaker, the cable starts to resist us less. And a simpler way to say this would simply be that the resistance that we're using is much more specific to the contraction of the rear delts. And so you might ask, well, Ben, if the rear delts aren't really contributing a ton to a face pull, like what is? Well, first of all, I'd just say do a set of rope face pulls to failure and just see what actually happens. Like, experiment around with what techniques actually get you to feel fatigue in your rear delts, and you'll find that it's very, very hard to get that area to actually fatigue. Where you're much more likely to feel fatigue are in these tissues back here, i.e. the middle traps, most specifically, potentially the rhomboids, right, which also pull the shoulder blade backward to some degree, as opposed to the rear delts. And so we don't want to use a resistance, in short, that is just, mostly loading this sort of shoulder blade motion at the start, and then by the time we get back here, it's still pulling us forward, but then again, loading these muscles to an even greater degree than the rear delt in terms of, this position and the position really that the rear delt would be loaded in. And we want to swap that for an exercise, which immediately starts to just pull the arm across the body. And many of you will just feel this. I mean, go up against a wall, like put your arm against the wall like this and just push into the wall. And what you'll sort of automatically start to feel is less of this stuff that in this exercise and in this context you don't want, and more of this stuff, i.e. the rear delts and the different parts of the rear delt, specifically because of how you've changed the loading direction and then also the position compared to the loading direction. So an alternative, and in practical terms, what I would recommend is simply just using some kind of reverse fly motion where the reverse fly is loaded significantly across your body as opposed to any kind of motion where your arms are getting pulled forward. It's not that any motion where your arms are getting pulled in this forward direction is bad. In fact, it'll be great for muscles like the lats and like the traps. But for loading the rear delt most specifically, we want to make sure that the primary bone that is loaded is this one throughout a majority of the range and not this one and this one. Because again, from a function standpoint, the rear delt is just going to function to pull the arm from a position that's, here and, maybe even across the body to then here, somewhere sort of in line with the body. So we really want to concentrate when we do this motion on basically just using the range of motion, which is mostly in front of the body and which is in more of a side to side direction as opposed to a front to back direction. And in addition to this, what you also might want to consider is the fact that you're probably already doing a lot of rowing-based motions. In other words, you're probably already doing motions where you're loading this position of the rear delt, which would be its sort of shorter muscle length. Let's say if you're doing something like a chest-supported row or something similar, right? And so in an ideal world, what we would do specifically for the rear delts is train a position that we not only don't train in other exercises like a normal row, i.e. this position, which is the ending position of the face pull, but an exercise where we would also want to actually just be much more specific to the tissue itself as compared to these other tissues, which in this case, in the case of a rope face pull, are going to honestly be the primary contributors to resisting the resistance. So in simple terms, basically just identify, hey, what the hell does the rear delt do? It pulls the arm outward like this. And because it pulls the arm outward like this, I want to load kind of in that direction. Now, many of you may be skeptical of this if you've had good experiences with the rope face pull. And if you have, I wouldn't recommend that you just all of a sudden remove them forever and stop doing them, but maybe just try a motion like this, right? Try a single arm reverse fly with a cable, or perhaps with a dumbbell where you can sort of maybe, lie down on a bench and do it that way, as opposed to this sort of rope face pull thing, and just observe how different it is from a local muscle recruitment to the rear delts as opposed to other muscles that you don't want to recruit as much.